For years and years, I loved shooter games. I used to play Apex and Fortnite all the time with my buddies. Nothing would beat that awesome thrill of queuing up into lobbies and just having a blast in online multiplayer. However, over the years, the thrill of those games started to fade, and as they did, so did my desire to play video games. I found everything stale, and I was just not feeling that urge to hop on. That is, until November of 2022, when I tried Elden Ring. I immediately fell in love with it, and to no one who's played the game's surprise, became obsessed with Fromsoftware and the empire of games that they had to offer. I've quickly finished Elden Ring and moved on to Bloodborne. From Bloodborne, I moved on to Sakuro, and from Sakuro to Dark Souls. I needed that thrill and that stubborn victory of ramming my head against a boss for 5 hours to finally get good. But why these games? And how did FromSoft manage to create the legendary status that it has today? In this video, I want to dive into their success and talk about why and how they succeeded in a genre that was relatively unplayed. This is the history and empire of FromSoftware. We start in 2009 with the release of Demon's Souls. Now, to be quite frank, this is the only one of these games that I have never personally played through. But I will say I've seen the whole game played through a few times and can speak on it with relative confidence. The game is set in a dark fantasy world, primarily in the medieval kingdom of Boletaria, which has been consumed by a mysterious fog. The Old One, a colossal, immortal, flying demon, has awakened, and the demons have emerged to consume the souls of men. The game's director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, drew inspiration from the King's Field series, particularly in the dark tone and in the high difficulty. Miyazaki aimed to create a game that would challenge players and push the limits on what a boss fight could be. Initially, the game received negative reactions at trade shows, and Sony, who was the publisher, was hesitant to release it outside of Japan. Miyazaki feared that Sony would ask the team to lower the difficulty to make the game more accessible. However, the team remained committed to their vision, and the game was released in Japan in February of 2009. Despite slow initial sales in Japan, positive word of mouth helped Demon's Souls sell over 100,000 copies, which the team considered a success. And the game's success in Japan led to its release in North America by Altus in October of 2009, and in PAL territories by Namco Bandai, partners in June 2010. Demon's Souls introduced several innovative design elements that would become staples of the Souls series. The game's high difficulty was a punishing and deliberate design choice intended to challenge players and encourage exploration and perseverance. The game's world was designed to be interconnected with areas and paths that encouraged exploration and discovery. The boss fights in Demon's Souls featured some of the most memorable and mechanically interesting boss fights in the Souls series, pushing the limits on what a boss fight could be. It tore down developmental trends that had taken over the industry, pioneering a new kind of online play. And it started a legacy that somehow feels just as fresh today as it did 15 years ago. Part of that freshness can definitely be contributed to the remake that came out recently, which I've seen a lot of, and it looks phenomenal, as you're seeing it right here. While players did love Demon's Souls' tough but fair combat, its real innovation lied in its multiplayer. Like FromSoft games that would follow it, Demon's Souls doesn't feature any traditional multiplayer mode. Instead, it lets players summon one another as phantoms for brief encounters. Players can't communicate and only stick around for a limited time, which Miyazaki has famously said was inspired by getting his car stuck on an icy hill and watching a line of drivers push one another out of the snow before departing, never to meet or exchange a single word. Overall, Demon's Souls is still a fantastic game, and it held up extremely well. As I'm rewatching footage of it for making this video, I will admit I need to get on it because it just looks really, really, really well done. I think everyone knows what comes next, so let's just talk about Dark Souls. Dark Souls is developed by FromSoftware and published by Namco Bandai Games. The game was released in 2011 for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It would later release for PC in 2012. This game was of course inspired by Demon's Souls, but also by Berserk, the dark fantasy manga series, which influenced the game's dark fantasy settings and themes. And as a lot of you know, that influence would recur heavily in almost every single game after. Looking at you, Guts Greatsword. Miyazaki started working on Dark Souls in 2008, a year before Demon's Souls was even released. The development process was guided by a spiritual successor approach that built upon the foundations laid by Demon's Souls while introducing new elements and refining the gameplay. The team aimed to create a more expansive and immersive world with a greater emphasis on exploration and discovery. Personally, I think they nailed it. The game's setting, Lordran, was designed to be a dark, gothic world with a focus on atmospheric tension and foreboding. And in result, Lordran was a dark, gothic world with a focus on atmospheric tension and foreboding. The game's design difficulty was once again a key focus, with Miyazaki aiming to create a challenging experience that rewarded perseverance and exploration. The team faced a lot of challenges in balancing the game's difficulty with its accessibility, and ultimately aimed to create a sense of accomplishment and satisfactions for players who persisted. I honestly think they did a really good job with this, and as punishing as it can feel sometimes, I think Dark Souls handles this really well. The game's art style was influenced by various sources, including Gothic architecture and Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints. I apologize for that pronunciation, but it was also obviously inspired by dark fantasy art as well. The amazing soundtrack, composed by Motoi, apologies once again, Sakuroba and Yuka Kitamuro, featured a haunting atmospheric score that complemented the genre's dark tone. I honestly wish I had experienced this game first, as it set the tone for the rest of the series so well that it truly is the best place to start. I mean, the game received widespread critical acclaim for its challenging gameplay, atmospheric setting, and deep lore. And one last fun fact about Dark Souls is its success actually is the reason Miyazaki was promoted to president of Fromsoftware, and they couldn't have made a better choice. Following the wild success of Dark Souls, there was only one possible direction to go: Dark Souls 2. Now, this game gets a lot of hate, a lot of deserved hate, but a lot of undeserved hate as well. Now, before you go running to the comments and biting my head off, my biggest gripe with this game is definitely just the horrific runbacks that you all know and hate probably as well, but I feel as though people rip into it a little bit too much. You see, Dark Souls was announced in December of 2012 during the Spike Video Game Awards with a CG trailer showcasing the game's world and characters. The game would go on to be released in March 2014 for PC, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. In an interview, director Tomohiro Shibuya mentioned that the new game would feature a new hero, storyline, and unfamiliar world, while still maintaining the signature Dark Souls gameplay and difficulty. Unfortunately, the development process was clearly rocky, with the gameplay undergoing significant changes midway through production. According to an interview with the other director, Yui, once again apologize, Tanimura, the team went back to the drawing board on the game's plot, themes, characters, and fights, resulting in a major overhaul. Now, I think that this shows a lot in the game, and you can see where things felt a little bit more rushed and a lot less polished. I also believe that Miyazaki choosing to supervise instead of being directly involved led to the game's less than sparkly finish. In fact, Shibuya was initially the co-director alongside Miyazaki, but Miyazaki was later replaced by Tanimura after disagreements and creative differences. The game's development team aimed to evolve the overall experience of the Dark Souls series, while also maintaining its challenging gameplay. They even introduced dedicated multiplayer servers, which was a departure from the game's original limited multiplayer features. On top of that, a new graphics engine was created to address frame rate issues and to enhance the game's atmosphere. The soundtrack and sound design were also revamped to better fit the game's world and tone. And with all the quality of life changes that they attempted to implement, I'm honestly surprised and sad that the game didn't turn out how fans had hoped. But luckily for them, there was a brilliant bright light at the end of this dark tunnel. Needing no introduction is Bloodborne. Bloodborne launched the era of what I like to call peak. The next 4 games Fromsoft was about to cook up can all be considered the best game in the franchise. In fact, if I had it my way, they all would have won their respective Game of the Year awards. But we'll get to those games later. For now, let's see what Yharnam has to offer. Bloodborne began development in 2012 under the working title Project Beast. Fromsoftware, who was renowned for their Dark Souls series, collaborated with Sony Japan to create this new IP. The game's director, who was none other than the returning main man, Miyazaki, aimed to combine the studio's learned expertise with innovative elements. This installment had the king back in charge, and with Miyazaki at the reins, you know he had something good cooking. The game released in March 2015, to a surprising amount of complaints. Critiques said the game's setting and environmental design were less inspiring than previous Fromsoftware titles, which I've realized that might be the worst take of like all time. I think Bloodborne and Sakuro, it's important to go into those games with the mindset that you're expecting something different. And Bloodborne clearly isn't Dark Souls or Demon Souls, and they show you that in many ways. The first and honestly biggest change is the lore. In previous FromSoft games, the lore is hidden in item descriptions and it takes less of a spotlight than the gameplay and the setting. But with Bloodborne, they constantly give you lore and crazy concepts to Siren. That being said, I think the atmosphere plays off of that perfectly, and it really gives you a true sense of actually being a hunter. Another big change that they made was the gun. Yes, this is probably what Bloodborne is known best for, Dark Souls with a Glock. And I have heard a lot of people complain about the parry mechanic in this game, and to each their own, but personally, I loved stepping up to Father G for the first time and figuring out you could riposte him over and over and over again. On top of that, the way the game redid bonfires and made the Hunter's Dream work so well is phenomenal. And hot take, but fuck the Chalice dungeon. Except for you, you have my heart. But I mean, seriously, those bitches sucked, and I stand by that. Thankfully, they do not affect the main story or the DLC. Speaking of the DLC though, Bloodborne probably has the best FromSoftware DLC. I know Elden Ring fans, it hurts. But as someone who stands on Elden Ring being the best game of all time, I feel for you. But there's something truly special about the Bloodborne DLC, and its bosses, Ludwig, Maria, and Orphan, are all phenomenal bosses. We don't talk about the living failures, but I mean, it holds up so incredibly well, and on top of that, the base game has multiple hidden areas that can be really easy to miss, but lead to some great bosses if you choose to seek them out. Now, unfortunately, Sony has sunk its greedy talons into Bloodborne, so we will be eternally stuck in 30 FPS. That's honestly a bit of a drawback, but regardless, I will stand and toot the Bloodborne horn until the day I die. And as to manage my time, I need to transition into another legendary title, but Bloodborne was a huge success and remains one of the more popular FromSoftware games to this day. And if it wasn't for the game being limited to PlayStation, 30 FPS, and the lack of good competitive multiplayer or cooperative multiplayer even, this game could have been their all-time best. But hey, good thing that not even a year later, they were ready with the release of Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 development began mid-2013, concurrent with the development of Bloodborne. This marked the return to the series for director Miyazaki, the creator of Dark Souls, who, as previously mentioned, had handed over direction duties for Dark Souls 2 to Shibuya and Tanimura. The game's development focused on refining the series and making the core gameplay stronger. Boosting mechanics such as combat, exploration, and character customization were a big focus for the team, and third-person perspective remained. Players had access to various weapons, armor, magic, and consumables to fight enemies. And this helped to boost the game's narrative, which explored the mythos of Dark Souls 3, delving into the lore of characters, locations, enemies, and bosses. The story revolves around the concept of the Dark Soul and of humanity, with the darkness not being inherently evil, but rather a resort of torture and mistreatment. The Abyss, a corrupted realm, is central to the narrative, and its creation is tied to the disturbance of the Dark Soul. This brought into creation Slave Knight Gale, who is up in the running for hardest boss in FromSoft history, and honestly, one of the best. But not only did this game have the iconic Gale, but it also introduced the Nameless King, Dark Eater Midir, and many other bosses. This is not to say that the previous games didn't have fantastic bosses, but the Dark Souls 3 boss roster really did shine, and the game's art style and atmosphere were refined, building upon the series' dark fantasy setting. The soundtrack, composed by Motoi Sakuroba and Yuka Kitaruma, featured a haunting and atmospheric score that complemented the game's world and narrative. Now, I'm gonna glaze a little more, but Dark Souls 3 received widespread critical acclaim, winning awards such as the Ultimate Game of the Year at the Golden Joystick Awards in 2016 and Role-Playing/Massively Multiplayer Game of the Year Award at the 20th Annual DICE Awards. Review scores ranged from 40 to 95 out of 100, with many considering it a fitting conclusion to the Dark Souls series. And honestly, seeing Overwatch win Game of the Year over this masterpiece was pretty gut-wrenching, as many consider this to be their favorite game in the franchise. This game received a whopping 3 DLC packs, which included Ashes of Arendelle, The Ringed City, and The Path of the Unkindled. These DLCs expanded the game's story and added new content, including areas, enemies, and bosses. Dark Souls 3 was revolutionary, and it paved the way for an entire genre called Souls-like. While there were spin-offs and knockoffs prior to Dark Souls 3, it wasn't until this game's incredible success that we saw an explosion in the genre. I know this video is getting long, and it's a little bit longer than I normally like to keep them, but Just bear with me as we are reaching the final two. And honestly, once again, some of the best too. Now, the middle child of the series is Sakuro. See, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is an amazing game, and having played through the game after playing Bloodborne and Elden Ring, let me just say, this game is hard as shit. Like, really, really hard. And I think if you come into the series with Sekiro as your first game, you honestly shouldn't struggle a ton, as long as you don't ring the bell. But coming into it with the freedom and flexibility that Bloodborne and Elden Ring give you was a rough transition. In fact, I quit the game for 2 months after beating the Chained Ogre, and I got stuck in that, like, gank fight that you'll see down here that allows these fucking idiots to all jump you, and my dumbass didn't know it was skippable until 2 months later. But when I did come back, I came hard, and this game is incredible. While being absolutely nothing like the previous installments, Sekiro deserves all the praise it gets. It's the most rewarding and the most difficult game in the series, as it forces the player to get good. There's no magic, there's no broken weapons, it's simply you, your katana, and a wooden arm that definitely shouldn't do that. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice began development in late 2015, shortly after the completion of Bloodborne's DLC. Miyazaki and Kazuhiro Hamatani worked side by side to make this game the masterpiece that Miyazaki envisioned. Sekiro's development focused on creating a more accessible and refined gameplay experience compared to the previous Fromsoftware titles. The game's prosthetic arm and ninja abilities were designed to provide a unique blend of stealth, vertical traversal, and visceral combat. They also aimed to create a more focused and directed experience, with a greater emphasis on storytelling and character development. The story very heavily affects the gameplay, and it's extremely easy to track along with the direction it goes. I think this game is an absolute standout, and the best boss fight is easily Ishin. I mean, it has 4 phases, including Genichiro, and constantly keeps you on your toes, forcing you to adapt and use many of your previously learned abilities. The game introduced a skill tree for the first time in the series, as well as visceral sneak attacks and that stupid Snake Eyes boss. Jokes aside, the game was genuinely challenging, and when I got stuck on pre-Severance Genichiro, I had no choice but to bunker down and learn his moves. On top of that, Sekiro features a vibrant and colorful art style, which is a departure from the dark and desolate environments of previous Fromsoftware games. The soundtrack, which was composed by Yuta Kitaruma, incorporates traditional Japanese instruments and uses melodies to create a haunting score that makes you feel as you yourself are following the shinobi code. Now, Sekiro clearly draws inspiration from Japanese history and culture, as well as the works of Japanese authors like Junji Ito and Ryusuke Akutagawa. The game's development was influenced by the team's desire to create a more accessible and appealing experience, while still maintaining the challenging, rewarding gameplay that FromSoftware is known for. And this is probably tied with Bloodborne for my second favorite game in the series. Now, obviously, it's amazing, but Bloodborne is just Bloodborne to me, and that holds a special place in my heart, but holy shit, did I really enjoy Sekiro. And this is a wake-up call for you fans out there who haven't played Sekiro. Play it. It's phenomenal, and 10 out of 10. But what's better than 10 out of 10? 11 out of 10. And who can have 11 out of 10 but Elden Ring? Now, this is where I'm going to get really opinionated on top of sharing the history behind it, because, wow, I have a very, very, very strong relationship with the game and have very, very, very few negative things to say about this game. It is my first love in the RPG world, and it showed me that there's a lot more to games than just what you're used to. Elden Ring opened up new doors for me that I had never considered an option, and it was a wonderful experience. Elden Ring began development in 2017, alongside Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, and after the release of the Ring City DLC for Dark Souls 3. Then, in 2018, director Miyazaki, back at it again, mentioned in an interview that there were multiple games in development, including 2 unannounced titles. This was followed by a first reveal trailer in 2019 that was shown during E3, and it didn't have an official release date yet. But we got a bombshell dropped on us in 2020 when George R.R. Martin, author of A Song of Ice and Fire, confirmed his involvement in the game's world building and overarching mythos. This led to so much hype as the game was officially released on February 25th, 2022, and a long and tedious process of creating this game led to it being that much more special. Having George R.R. Martin being involved was honestly a pretty cool twist that helped me get excited for it. And as a big Game of Thrones fan, I knew he was about to cook, and boy did he. I think Elden Ring is something different that can't be placed in the exact same category as the other games. While they don't shove the lore down your throat entirely, they certainly don't go out of your way to make sure you don't catch it, and it's not by any means obscure. While the game has a massive open world, and I'll get more to that in a second, it still tells you where to go without forcing you down a path. The team gave Martin complete creative freedom to write the backstory and foundation for the game's universe. This in turn also gave the studio more time to build upon his work and focus on environmental scale, stat management, and storytelling. Fun fact, a few Game of Thrones staff members actually assisted in the creation of this game, and the game obviously won Game of the Year in 2022, and if the community had its way, the DLC would win again this year. And Elden Ring did something no other game in the franchise had done before. By giving the world an open map, this allowed for the most flexible of playstyles, challenge runs, and more. As local Elden Ring sicko Scumnut would tell you, being able to gather items and equipment from almost any region before even fighting the first boss can be so helpful. And for players like me who are new to the genre, this allowed me to maximize my build and ease me into the learning curve. I think a lot of people hate on Elden Ring because it has too many options, which is the new worst take ever, because Elden Ring gives you the choice to play it literally however you want. Runners like Gino have gone on to set crazy records, doing runs with almost every weapon type in the game. And I think that the freedom Elden Ring gives its players is easily the biggest improvement that FromSoft has made. And that just about does it. For the insane run that FromSoftware has been on, I hope that the next game continues to follow the trend, and maybe I'll throw that one in there and make a recap. But it truly is crazy to look back and see just how far they have come and how amazing of a company FromSoftware is. I mean, hit after hit after hit, even including Dark Souls 2, which is very replayable and still quite good. I mean, I can't believe Miyazaki has said that he's still working on his magnum opus, which I personally cannot wait to play. And as I bring this video to a close, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported me on my last video. I've been working really hard to make these videos, and it's something I'm extremely passionate about. Obviously, the dream would be to do this full time, but even if that never happens, having supporters like you guys who watch these videos and leave me feedback is incredibly helpful and encouraging. I cannot thank you guys enough, and I should have another video coming out soon, so keep an eye out for that. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you all shortly. Cheers.